Okay, let's unpack this. India, everyone knows it as the pharmacy of the world, right? For the sheer volume of generic drugs they export.
That's right. Huge volumes.
Now, they've set their sights on something, well, much bigger, becoming a global powerhouse, not just in quantity, but in high-value pharma exports.
Exactly. And we're diving deep into this really comprehensive report. It's called Healing the World, a roadmap for making India a global pharma exports hub.
Sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. It lays out this detailed strategy, basically how India can transform its whole pharma sector and, really boost its contribution to global healthcare. They're aiming for a massive export target by 2047.
Okay, so our mission today is to really pull out the key stuff from that report for you, our listener. What's the path they're suggesting? What are the big opportunities, the challenges too, I guess?
Definitely the challenges.
And maybe most importantly, what could this huge shift actually mean? For global healthcare, and for you, especially if you're interested in these major economic and industry changes.
Well, the core idea, the real hook here, I think, is that India is already huge in volume for generics, right? Largest supplier.
Right.
But there's this enormous, uh, largely untapped potential to move up, go up the value chain.
So it's making that leap from being the world's pharmacy just by volume to becoming a leader based on, well, value.
That's the goal, a value-driven leader.
So how does the report say they can actually do that, hitting that staggering number, what was it, nearly $350 billion in exports by 2047?
Yeah, it's a huge number. Let's dive in.
Okay,
So first, you kind of have to zoom out. Look at the big picture. India's economy is growing fast.
right. They have that national goal, the $35 trillion economy by 2047.
Exactly. And the pharmaceutical industry isn't just like a small part of that. It's seen as absolutely central to hitting that target.
Yeah, you can see why when you look at what it already does.
Hmm.
I mean, it's critical for manufacturing, brings in a lot of foreign investment, FDI,
Yes, significant amounts.
generates a $19 billion trade surplus right now. That's pretty healthy.
It is. 19 billion. And it supports around 2.7 million livelihoods. So it's a big deal already.
And their footprint is global, even now. Largest supplier of generics worldwide.
Yep, meeting about 20% of the global demand for generics. Think about that.
Wow.
Supplying half of Africa's generics, 40% of generics in the U.S.?
40% in the U.S., that's huge.
It is. By volume of exports, they're third globally.
Third globally. And that's built on a massive infrastructure, right? Loads of facilities.
Oh, yeah. Over 10,000 manufacturing facilities,
Yeah.
more than 3,000 companies. And this is key. 650 plants that meet the U.S. FDA standards.
It's a tough U.S. standard.
Right, and that's the largest number of U.S. FDA-compliant plants outside the U.S. itself.
Okay, so strong base, but here's the catch, right? The value part.
Exactly. This is what the report really hammers home. Despite being third in volume, they're only 11th globally by value.
The 11th. Wow.
Yeah, accounting for just 3% of total pharma exports by value. So you see this huge gap. And that gap is the challenge, but it's also the massive opportunity, transitioning from just shipping boxes to leading in higher value products.
A major strategic shift. And that's where the $350 billion target comes in, a 10 to 15-fold increase.
It's incredibly ambitious, no doubt. But the report points to 7 big global megatrends, things happening worldwide that are actually creating a unique window of opportunity for India, playing right into their potential.
Okay, like global tailwinds pushing them forward.
Exactly. Think of them like that. Powerful tailwinds.
Great, let's break those down. What's the first one?
First up is supply chain resilience. COVID really showed everyone how fragile global supply chains can be.
Especially for essential stuff like medicines.
Yeah. So developed economies, they're not just thinking about bringing manufacturing back home. They're actively trying to diversify, to get away from relying too much on one single source.
And let's be honest, that single source is often China, right?
Yeah, that's largely the subtext. You've got global initiatives like the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, all pushing for more secure, diverse supply chains.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Recent laws, like the U.S. Biosecure Act, that restricts some partnerships with certain Chinese biotech firms. That directly creates openings for India.
So it's moving beyond just finding the cheapest option. It's about security, reliability,
Yeah.
quality, too.
Absolutely. Quality is huge. The report actually notes that Indian API makers, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core stuff in drugs, They've shown better U.S. FDA inspection results over the last decade compared to the big Chinese producers.
That's interesting.
And you're already seeing big global pharma companies strategically shifting more of their business towards Indian partners.
What about India's own efforts, like the Make in India schemes, the PLI incentives?
Yeah, they definitely play a role. About $3 billion set aside for pharma and medical devices under PLI, and it's pulling in investment.
There's always a but.
Well, the report points out India still depends heavily on China for a lot of basic bulk drugs, around 72% last year.
72%. Wow.
So the PLI is good, but maybe it needs tweaking. Perhaps more focus on supporting these CDMOs and CRO, the service providers.
Right. The contract development and manufacturing folks.
Exactly. And supporting high-value stuff like biologics, not just basic generics.
Okay. Makes sense. What's the second big trend?
It's the growing R&D and quality focus within India itself.
Ah, so internal improvements.
Right. The top Indian pharma companies are really stepping up their R&D spending. And they're specifically targeting these high-value products. The top 10 players, they have over 40 innovative drugs or biologics, these NCEs and MBEs, in their pipelines right now.
And globally, quality standards are just getting tougher, right?
Oh, absolutely. Regulators everywhere are getting stricter, handing out bigger penalties for non-compliance.
How's India doing on that front?
Making progress. The report says the percentage of U.S. FDA inspections that result in an official action indicated, basically, major problems needing fixing that's dropped. It was 19% in 2013, down to 9% in 2023.
Better, but still needs work.
Yeah, it's still a bit higher than the global average, which is around 4%. So definite improvement, but closing that gap completely is crucial for trust and access.
And things like aligning their own rules, like Schedule M with global standards like WHO's good manufacturing practices, that must help.
Hugely important. There's a quote in the report from an industry leader saying something like, India's manufacturing costs are the lowest, but compliance is key to grow exports.
Right.
We've embraced digital to eliminate errors and ensure consistent quality. It really highlights that mix. Cost advantage needs rock-solid quality, and tech is helping bridge that.
Interesting how digital comes into quality. Okay, sticking to the reports list, what's trend number 3?
The third trend is this shift toward value via CDMOs and CROs.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, historically, companies outsourced manufacturing to India, mainly because it was cheap. Large-scale basic stuff.
Right.
But now, as India's own R&D skills improve, global firms are outsourcing more of the whole process, from early research right through clinical trials.
So Indian firms aren't just making the pills, they're helping invent them.
Getting closer to that, yeah. Indian CDMOs and CROs are focusing more on providing services for these high-value innovative products. Some Indian companies are even licensing out their own early-stage drug ideas to global partners.
Wow, okay.
And this growth in contract services, it doesn't just bring in revenue, it builds up critical talent and know-how for future domestic innovation.
Right, it creates an ecosystem.
Exactly. One exec quoted said something like, our company is shifting focus to innovation. About 50% of our revenue last year came from innovation-related work. That shows a real shift happening on the ground.
Okay, trend number 4, what's next?
Fourth is growing regulatory harmonization. Basically, there's a global push to simplify and standardize drug approval rules across different countries.
Like making it easier to get a drug approved in multiple places.
Yeah, things like the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Program, the US FDA's Project Orbis for cancer drugs, the EMA's centralized procedure in Europe. They all aim to streamline things.
And how does that help India specifically?
Well, if the rules become more similar and predictable across major markets, it just makes it easier and cheaper for Indian companies to get their products approved and sold globally. Less duplication, less complexity.
Got it. Makes sense. Megatrend 5.
Robust funding. This one's key. Investment is pouring into the Indian healthcare sector, especially from private equity and venture capital.
Really? More than other sectors?
Yeah. Healthcare share of PEVC money in India jumped significantly. It went from 6% in 2021 to 17% in the first half of 2024. That's the fastest growth of any sector.
Wow, 17%. That's a strong signal from investors.
It really is. And you see PEs doing these platform plays, buying up several companies to create bigger integrated players. VC interest in biotech is also booming.
So that's fueling the innovation side.
Definitely. India is now a top 12 global biotech destination. The industry there is valued at, $130 billion today, projected to hit $300 billion by 2030.
Leading to more startups.
Thousands of them. Over 6,000 biotech startups now, maybe over 10,000 by 2025. All this capital is absolutely essential for building the advanced capabilities India needs for things like biopharma.
Okay, trend number 6, you mentioned it earlier, digitalization and generative AI.
Right. This plays to India's existing strengths in IT, applying that tech know-how to pharma.
How?
Digital tools, transforming manufacturing industry 4.0 stuff, better quality control, smarter supply chains, and then there's generative AI.
The buzzword of the year.
Well, it shows huge promise in speeding up R&D, drug discovery, even helping with clinical decisions down the line. Indian companies are actively exploring AI platforms for finding new drugs.
Did the report quantify the AI impact?
It mentioned a Bain survey suggesting that combining Gen AI with traditional AI could maybe double the value unlocked compared to just traditional AI alone in the next few years.
Double the value.
Yeah. It's still early days for AI adoption in Indian pharma, but it's seen as a potential game changer for innovation and staying competitive globally.
Okay, and the final megatrend, number 7.
The global push for sustainability. ESG, environmental, social governance factors.
Right, becoming huge everywhere.
It's becoming non-negotiable for international business. Big markets like the EU are writing ESG clauses into trade deals. The UK's National Health Service has net zero targets that affect its suppliers. Global pharma giants have their own big ESG goals.
So Indian exporters basically have to get on board with this. It's not optional.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Not if they want to play in the big leagues. It's pushing Indian firms to really strengthen their ESG strategies. Some leaders like Sun Pharma, Dr. Reddy's, Cipla are already doing a lot.
But it needs to be broader.
Yeah, wider adoption across the industry is needed for long-term competitiveness.
Yeah.
Things like waste management, green energy, traceable supply chains.
Okay, so if you put all 7 of those trends together, what's the big picture takeaway?
It's like a perfect storm, really. You've got these global pushes like needing resilient supply chains, wanting simpler regulations, demanding sustainability.
Right, external factors.
Meeting India's growing internal strengths, better R&D, growing service capabilities and CDMO CRO, the digital edge, more funding flowing in.
So it's this unique alignment, this convergence that creates the opening for that massive shift from volume to value.
Exactly. These trends work together to make India a much more attractive and capable partner for the global pharmaceutical industry.
Fantastic overview of those tailwinds. Now, let's get into the specifics. The report breaks down different export segments, right? Where does it see the biggest opportunities, the targets, the challenges?
Right. It dives into 5 key areas to map out that path to $350 billion. You've got API and generics, then biosimilars, vaccines, innovative products, and finally, the CDMO CRO services.
Okay, let's start with the foundation. API and generics, strengthening the core, as the report puts it.
Yeah. The global API market, those active ingredients, again, it's already huge, $240 billion or so, and growing.
What's driving the growth?
Things like aging populations globally, more lifestyle diseases, new types of drug chemistry coming online, and just the ongoing demand for cheaper generic medicines. And importantly, the outsourced API market is growing faster than the market for APIs made in-house by big pharma.
And China has been the big player in outsourced APIs.
Historically, yes, they have about 35% of that outsourced share now. But because of that supply chain diversification push we talked about.
A China +1.
Right. The report thinks China's share could drop quite a bit, maybe 10 percentage points by 2030.
And India's poised to grab that share.
That's the opportunity. India could potentially pick up 20–30% of that shifting market in the near term. Why? Cost, better service, skilled people.
So what's the API export target for India?
The report aims for $80 to $90 billion by 2047. But getting there needs investment, especially in more complex, high-value chemistries like using fermentation or making these high-potency APIs, HP APIs.
And making more of the basic ingredients themselves.
Exactly. Better backward integration. Making more of the key starting materials, the KSMs, in India, so they rely less on imports, often from China, for the absolute basics.
Okay, what about generic formulations? The finished pills and medicines. India's already a giant there by volume.
Huge by volume. The global market for finished generics is also massive, set to grow significantly. India exports about $19 billion now, mostly finished drugs.
But the report says the focus isn't just more volume here, it's value again.
Absolutely. It's about dramatically upgrading the value of those generic exports.
How do you upgrade value in generics? Aren't they just generic?
Through what they call specialty generics. These aren't your standard tablets. Think complex stuff. Injectables, inhalers, patches, eye drops, soft gels.
Harder to make, I assume.
Much harder. They need more complex manufacturing, trickier regulatory approvals, sometimes even clinical trials. But the payoff is much higher prices and better profit margins.
And they're growing faster.
Yeah, specialty generics are growing around 12% a year, compared to maybe 7% for the simpler commodity generics.
So the opportunity is jumping on those complex drugs when the original patents run out.
Precisely. There's a wave of patent expiries coming over 1,000 drugs
Hmm.
in the next 7, 8 years. Lots of injectables and inhalants among them. It's a huge window if India can make high-quality, complex versions.
What's the export target for generic formulations then?
Ambitious again. 180 to $190 billion by 2047.
Wow. How?
It needs a smart geographic strategy, really targeting deeper penetration in the big markets, the US, the top 5 EU countries, Latin America. India's market share in many of these places is still surprisingly low, like under 5%, so there's huge room to grow.
What does that mean for the companies themselves?
For basic generics, it's about speed, quality, automation. Be the first, be reliable. For the specialty stuff, it's different. You need clinical trial capabilities, people on the ground internationally, maybe skills in M&A or partnerships to get access to complex products or markets.
And what support does the government need to provide for this?
The report suggests things like tax breaks for R&D, especially for clinical trials, streamlining approvals, helping companies understand and access global markets, better market intelligence, help with trade deals.
Expanding efforts like Pharmexil?
Yeah, boosting those.
Yeah.
And infrastructure is critical. The report calls for dedicated pharma and bulk drug parks, much larger scale than what exists now, with shared facilities, learning from places like China's big industrial zones.
Okay, moving up the value chain again, let's talk biosimilars. That's a hot area globally.
It really is. Biosimilars, basically generic versions of complex biologic drugs often made using living cells.
Right, much more complex than traditional chemical drugs.
Exactly. That market is about $30 billion now, but it's projected to explode. Maybe hit $100 billion by 2030, growing at 20% a year.
Why such fast growth?
Several reasons. Biologics themselves are becoming a bigger slice of the overall drug market. Chronic diseases treated by biologics are rising. Regulators are creating clearer pathways for biosimilar approvals. And there's a massive patent cliff coming for original biologic drugs. Over $180 billion worth are losing patent protection in the next 7 years.
Huge opportunity, but India's share is small right now.
Very small, less than 5%, about $70 billion in exports currently.
So a big climb needed.
Yes, but the top Indian companies are investing heavily, ramping up R&D, building manufacturing capacity. Government initiatives like the National Biopharma Mission and PLI schemes are also trying to boost this sector.
There was a quote you mentioned earlier linking this to the national ambition.
Yeah, about India playing a role in affordable access, first with generics, now potentially with high-quality affordable biologics, shifting from cost arbitrage to value creation, contributing to that Viksit Bharat or developed India goal. It really captures the vision for this segment.
So what's the 2047 export target for biosimilars?
The report estimates $30 to $35 billion. It sees biosimilars kind of following the path of generic formulations, but maybe with an 8-year lag because they're more complex.
Are global trends helping India here?
Some are. Simpler approval pathways in the U.S., like interchangeability and bioequivalence, potentially removing the need for some clinical trials. That helps. One exec noted that this would streamline investment. And maybe even the Biosecure Act indirectly helps here, too.
But India is still behind competitors like China and South Korea in biosimilars.
They are. So strategy is vital. Companies need to figure out how to enter markets, develop their own. License one in, partner up, maybe acquire a company.
And how they sell them.
Yeah, innovative commercial approaches. Tiered pricing, discounts depending on the market, and critically speed. You need to be among the first 3 biosimilars to launch when a patent expires.
Why the first 3?
The data shows they grab the lion's share of the market, like 30–40%. If you're 4th or 5th, it's much harder. So accelerating development is key.
What about government support needed for biosimilars?
Dedicated biopharma parks again. Lowering startup costs, R&D incentives, training for specialized skills, fostering partnerships, looking at models like Singapore's Biopolis or South Korea's clusters for inspiration.
Okay, let's shift gears to vaccines. India is already a major player here by volume, right? The Serum Institute.
Absolutely. A superpower by volume. The global vaccine market, if you exclude the COVID surge, is about $80 billion and growing steadily. India, mainly through the Serum Institute, has about 12% of the global volume share, second only to the big MNCs.
But same story as generics. Volume high, value low.
Exactly the same pattern. By value, Serum Institute is way down at 10th globally with only a 2% share.
That's a massive difference. Why?
Primarily because India's focus has been on providing huge volumes of very affordable vaccines to low and middle-income countries,
Mm.
LICs and MSCs. They're the biggest supplier to UNICEF, for example.
So they haven't cracked the high-income country markets.
Largely not. Penetrating those markets, where most of the value is tough. Partly its reputation. The low-cost producer tag can unfortunately impact trust for something sensitive like vaccines. And partly it's just the dominance of the big multinational pharma companies who usually develop the newest vaccines first.
One expert quote mentioned hesitancy.
Yeah, developed countries exhibit hesitancy towards vaccines for the developing world. It highlights that challenge. Plus the fact that MNCs often dominate because they innovate first.
So how does the report see India bridging this value gap in vaccines? What's the target?
The target is $24 to $25 billion in vaccine exports by 2047.
How do they get there?
The plan is twofold. First, significantly increase market share in the low and middle-income countries where they're already strong. Second, make a strategic push into the high-income countries, aiming for maybe 3% market share there by 2047. It's a longer-term play for the HICs.
What strategies do Indian vaccine makers need?
They need to target specific high-demand vaccines, maybe like pneumococcal, PCV, or flu vaccines. Build partnerships in middle-income countries. For the high-income markets, it's a bigger investment. Robust clinical trials, navigating tough regulations, ensuring top-tier manufacturing, building sales teams.
Leveraging technology transfers, expanding beyond kids' vaccines.
Yes, exactly. Partnering to get new tech, moving into adult vaccines like shingles or RSV, maybe even mRNA eventually, and building up vaccine CDM services could be another angle.
What about government help for the vaccine sector?
Dedicated vaccine hubs or parks, not just general biotech clusters. Maybe funding support for building plants, even potentially in places like Africa. A big one is streamlining regulatory approvals. Indian timelines are currently much longer than in developed nations.
Cutting down that approval time.
Massively. Plus developing specialized talent in vaccinology and immunology. And encouraging R&D into new vaccine technologies and diseases. Aligning regulations with the US and EU is also seen as key for easier access to those developed markets.
Okay, now for what the report calls the last frontier. Innovative products. Brand new drugs, NCEs and NBs. This is where the big value is globally, right?
Absolutely. This is the largest slice of the global pharma market. About $800 billion now, heading towards $1.4 trillion by 2030.
Wow. Driven by what?
Rising rates of chronic diseases, and significantly, the increasing dominance of biologic drugs. Biologics are expected to be over half this market by 2030.
And India's position here is just starting.
Very early stage, yeah. But there's promise. Top Indian firms, as we said, have over 40 of these new chemical or biological entities in their development pipelines.
How does the report see Indian companies getting into this innovation game? It identifies different models.
Yeah, and it outlines three main paths. First is in-licensing or acquiring innovative drugs that were developed elsewhere, like Sun Pharma did with a drug called Illumia.
So buy or license your way in.
Right. It diversifies your portfolio, gets you into the innovative space quickly without needing your own massive discovery R&D setup initially.
Okay. Second model.
Out-licensing. This is where an Indian company develops a drug candidate internally, maybe to an early stage, and then licenses it out to a global partner.
Why do that?
It lets them make money from their early research. But importantly, it shares the huge risk and cost of late-stage clinical trials. Plus, they could leverage the global partner's marketing muscle. This is actually the most common model for Indian firms right now.
And the third model, the ultimate goal.
That's the end-to-end approach. Discovering, developing, testing, getting approval for, and selling a completely new drug, all driven by an Indian company itself.
From scratch to market.
Exactly. This is seen as the pathway to becoming a true global pharma powerhouse. Very few examples yet, but it's where the big future potential lies. There's optimism, though. One quote suggests, "We're optimistic of one Indian company eventually developing an innovative product end-to-end, setting in place a virtuous cycle."
That would be a huge milestone. What's the export target for innovative products?
Assuming progress on that end-to-end model, the report targets $13 to $15 billion by 2047. It even calls this estimate potentially conservative if things go really well. By 2030, maybe $2 billion, mostly from the licensing models.
So what do companies need to do to make that end-to-end dream a reality?
Well, prioritize R&D, maybe focus on areas like rare diseases or cancer where there's high value. Crucially, they need to massively increase R&D spending. There's a big gap, like 18 percentage points, between top Indian firms and the global top 10 in R&D as a share of revenue.
Closing that spending gap.
Yeah. One exec mentioned aiming to go from maybe 7% to 9% of revenue on R&D, still a way to go. They also need expertise in cutting-edge tech cell therapy, gene therapy, and really integrating AI into drug discovery is seen as vital for efficiency. Collaboration is also key, partnering with global pharma, biotechs, universities.
And what's the government's role in fostering this innovation?
Encouraging that academia-industry collaboration, providing R&D subsidies, maybe dedicated funding for innovative product development, ensuring the intellectual property laws are strong and clear, creating fast, smooth regulatory pathways for new drugs.
Funding seems critical here, too.
Absolutely. A much stronger VC and specialized funding ecosystem is needed. The report starkly contrasts U.S. biotech funding, like $57 billion a year, with India's maybe $5 billion over a whole decade. That funding gap for early-stage, high-risk innovation needs to shrink. Quotes emphasize needing mechanisms to support patient access to new drugs, which reduces company risk, and a regulatory system that's fast, consultative, and staffed by skilled people.
Okay, last segment. CDMO-CRO, leadership and services.
Right, the contract development and manufacturing organizations and contract research organizations. This global market for services across the drug life cycle is huge. $187 billion now, growing to maybe $355 billion by 2030.
What's driving that growth?
The sheer complexity of the global drug pipeline, new technologies like AI needing specialized expertise, and just ongoing pressure on pharma companies to control costs by outsourcing more activities.
And you said this sector helps fuel India's own innovation.
It really does. By providing these high-end services, Indian companies build up the skills and infrastructure they can then potentially use for their own drug development efforts.
How's India doing in CRC-DMO currently?
Growing fast. The CRO market, the research side, doubled between 2019 and 2023 to $2.5 billion. That's much faster growth than the global average, driven by India's huge pool of STEM grads and improving IP protection, making it safer to outsource R&D there.
And the manufacturing services, the CDMO part?
Also doubled since 2019, hitting $20 billion last year. And future growth here looks really strong, largely thanks to that China +1 supply chain diversification trend.
The Biosecure Act helping again.
Potentially a big catalyst, yeah. Indian CDMOs are positioning themselves as the high-quality, lower-cost, reliable alternative.
So what's the 2047 target for CDMO-CRO exports?
A massive $150 to $155 billion combined. About $20 billion from CROs, $130 billion from CDMOs.
Leapfrogging China in some areas.
The report thinks India could overtake China in small molecule CDMO by 2030, and maybe even match China's current share in large molecule biologics CDMO by 2047. It's a bullish forecast. One quote says, "The future of Indian CDMOs is bright. Indian players are well poised to build the size and scale needed to compete."
What do companies in this space need to do?
Demonstrate they have the capacity to build more, use existing capacity better, leverage that PEVC funding, strengthen their AI and digital service offerings, expand into more complex, high-value tech areas, things like peptides, HPPIs, ADCs, antibody-drug conjugates. And for biologics CDMO, really invest heavily in the discovery, development, and manufacturing capabilities needed to compete with the global leaders like Samsung or WuXi.
And government support for the service sector.
Top priority. Strictly enforce those good manufacturing practices. The revised Schedule M quality has to be absolutely consistent. Promoting India as a hub for clinical trials is another big one. Leverage the patient diversity and skilled workforce. Maybe ease rules on early-stage trials for foreign drugs, offer incentives, and keep developing specialized talent. The report stresses needing consistent regulations along with a culture of quality, safety, sustainability, coupled with a highly skilled talent pool.
Okay, so pulling all those segments together, the core generics, APIs, biosimilars, vaccines, innovation, and services, the report synthesizes this into a path forward, right, with key recommendations.
Exactly. It draws lessons partly from how China built its own industries, focus zones, infrastructure, regulatory changes, talent development. It offers recommendations across short, medium, and long terms.
What are some of the most critical government actions highlighted, short term?
Creating a much more supportive R&D environment. More funding than the current schemes provide. Definitely streamlining clinical trial approvals. That's a major bottleneck now. Also, mapping out global demand better and creating specific plans for key markets like the US and EU, tackling their unique barriers.
Like actively negotiating market access.
Precisely. Enhancing trade support schemes like RODITEP to make exports cheaper, fixing GST issues that hurt competitiveness, and fundamentally improving ports and lowering domestic logistics costs, which are still relatively high.
Okay, and medium term.
Things like formal policy support, maybe a dedicated pharma chapter in the foreign trade policy, getting infrastructure status for the sector to make financing easier, really promoting brand India, globally consistent presence at trade shows, maybe even pharma attachés in embassies.
Fostering that innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, building strong links between industry, universities, startups, accelerating talent development, and crucially, strictly enforcing quality standards that revise Schedule M. The report uses that powerful analogy about airline safety.
Right. Grounding the plane if even one check fails. Applying that rigor to pharma.
Exactly. Because lives depend on it.
And long-term, what's the focus there?
Aiming for membership in key global standard-setting bodies like ICH and PICS. Being part of those groups signals high standard and makes market access much easier, especially in developed countries.
The report sums this up with a mantra, Quality.
Yeah, it's a neat acronym. Quality, regulation, access to global markets, talent, and entrepreneurial innovation. Those are seen as the pillars for success.
And it points to specific swing factors, things that could really make or break the $350 billion vision.
Yes, success in those high-value specialty generics, getting those large integrated bulk drug parks up and running to secure the supply chain for key ingredients and advanced chemistries. And maybe the biggest swing factor, fostering that entrepreneurial innovation and high-level talent needed for creating brand new drugs end-to-end.
Does the report downplay near-term challenges like interest rates or shipping costs?
It acknowledges them, yeah, but kind of frames them as temporary bumps in the road. It notes government is working on some of them, like container availability. The report's focus is very much on the long-term structural opportunity driven by those big megatrends.
So the bottom line is, a 10-fold growth target is incredibly ambitious, but the report lays out a roadmap suggesting it's achievable.
Achievable, yes, but with huge caveats. It hinges entirely on really deep, sustained collaboration between the industry and the government. Everyone pulling in the same direction.
And it's about more than just export dollars.
Absolutely. The narrative is about India becoming the healthcare custodian of the world. Providing essential medicines, yes, but also driving future innovation. And contributing to that national goal of becoming a Viksit Bharat, a developed India.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into what sounds like a truly transformative plan. It's clear this isn't just about economics for India. It's about their whole role in global health potentially shifting.
Yeah, moving from just supplying affordable basics to potentially being a source of future innovation, too.
Which, for you listening, could impact everything from the global supply chains for your medicines to healthcare costs to where the next big medical breakthroughs might actually come from.
It really could ripple outwards significantly. Understanding this potential shift is pretty vital wherever you are in the world.
Yeah.
Just to anticipate how drug availability, market dynamics, maybe even research priorities might change.
So considering everything we've talked about, the need for talent, for government R&D support, for that crucial industry-academia collaboration to really spark innovation, what single area do you think is the absolute most critical linchpin for India to successfully make that huge leap, to go from volume leader to a true value leader in global pharma by 2047?